One of the burning questions we're asking ourselves right now concerns our diet. Should we eat meat? Let's discuss. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show for change makers. Should we eat meat? Some people have ethical or moral concerns, but even on a practical level, there are lots of factors that add complexity to answering that question. While there are limits to what we can do in one video, let's dive down that rabbit hole and try and come up with some balanced answers. And the first thing to say is that I'm not going to get into the morality side. If you have a strong belief that it's never ever right to eat animals purely for moral reasons, those are entirely valid personal beliefs, you won't be much satisfied with a pragmatic take such as this one. I give you fair warning. However, for the time being, such views are worldwide in a small minority. Maybe at some point in the future that won't be the case, but there are other reasons for asking the question, and there are pros and cons that are interesting to explore. Now, this video owes a huge amount to Vaclav Smil's book of the same name. Much of the information I cover here was originally gathered together in that book, which if you have a deeper interest in this topic, I recommend. And first off, it's worth putting all of this into a historical context, because one of the reasons why meat eating is so embedded in most of our societies across the globe has a lot to do with where we come from. And I mean, if you go back a long way, if you go right back to the early evolution of Homo sapiens, it was when we made the move from foraging to meat eating that more advanced evolution even became possible. A study in 1999 showed that meat eating enabled the evolution of human intelligence, partly because of the refinement of cognitive abilities needed for the strategic sharing of meat within the group, but also because brain growth was directly linked with meat consumption. Per unit of mass, the brain needs about 16 times the energy as standard muscle. The only way these larger brains could be supported without raising the overall metabolic rate of the body was to reduce the size of another major metabolic organ. The gastrointestinal tract was the only tissue whose size could be reduced, but that was dependent on the quality of the diet. Higher quality diet in terms of proteins and other nutrients could support a reduction in the relative gut mass and consequently an increase in brain size. Our predecessors, the Neanderthals, became deliberate hunters, and we took that over from them as we arose and displaced them. But throughout history, meat eating that was dependent on hunting and killing wild animals was a pretty hit and miss affair. It led to the development of aspects of human society with cooperation, sharing and cooking, but hunting was often not successful and it could be very dangerous. As our society settled, we moved into permanent cropping and domesticating animals. That helped, but things didn't necessarily just become ideal because of that. The truth of human history is that most of the time, indeed until very recently, poverty was standard and starvation was waiting close by. There were high incidences of malnutrition, regular occurrence of major famines, even into the modern era, up until about the Napoleonic times. Famines were common. High population densities were supported by low-intensity farming. As a result, traditional agricultural societies subsisted on diets that had only a very little meat. And as a result, higher levels of meat eating became seen as the desirable outcome of growing levels of affluence. But for most, the only way you could support sufficient people came from a largely meatless diet. A farm with crop rotation, heavy manuring and irrigation could produce enough to feed 5 to 10 people per hectare. The value of animals as the means to pull the plough and to provide milk and manure and wool massively outweighed their value as a one-time source of meat. So for a very long time, levels of meat eating stayed at very low, and this often led to inadequate amounts of high-quality protein in the diet, bearing in mind that we know a lot more now about how you can nutritionally balance a low-meat or zero-meat diet. So, at the beginning of the 19th century, it's thought that meat consumption contributed less than 3% of energy to, for instance, the French diet. And it became, as a consequence, a high-prestige food. The nobility could have banquet feasts upon the wild meat that was protected for their use by hunting bans, Unsurprisingly, this meant that as societies the world over came out of poverty, where there wasn't a cultural restriction, usually religious, meat consumption was embraced as a desirable route to better nutrition, and just generally as a sign of high status. The use of mechanisation in farming and the creation of artificial fertilisers brought significantly higher crop yields than before, and higher crop yields made it possible to use more land for animal feed. At the beginning of the 20th century, just over 10% of the global grain harvest was fed to animals, most of which were work animals for pulling ploughs, not for meat. But by 1950, that had changed to 20%. By the end of the century, it was 40%. Add to that other technical advances such as refrigeration and large commercial shipping, and the stage was set for a diet revolution. Over a century, diets went through a major transformation. Europe and North America saw meat consumption rise rapidly, the richest countries of East Asia kicked in after 1950, and many others really only in the last couple of decades, China for instance. And the transformation has arguably yet to begin in sub-Saharan Africa. It's led to transformed patterns of global trade, with prime areas producing surpluses that are traded to other regions, and there's been some globalisation of tastes, with hamburgers, fried chicken and pizza becoming global food types, which is why it's no accident that the world's two largest multinational fast food companies, KFC and McDonald's, made their success on the sale of affordable meat. And it's worth just noting how much our relationship to food production has changed over that time as well. In 1850, 3/4 of America's labour force was still working on the farms. Within 20 years, that had dropped below 50%. By 1900, the population had tripled, but only 1/3 were working on the farms. The transformation of how we produce food was what enabled industrialisation, urban living and everything that has led to the society we have today. Crudely put, if we hadn't emptied the fields of human beings, we wouldn't have had them available to fill the factories. In addition, our efficiency in maximising the amount of meat we produce within a certain time has soared as we've identified all the factors and learned how to optimise them. In the 1930s, for instance, the average weight of chickens at slaughter was 1.3 kilograms. In 2010, it had reached 2.58 kilograms. And whereas it took 113 days to reach the end weight in the 1930s, that could be done in 42 days by 2010. Most of that change came about because of genetic selection, breeding, and most of the rest because of optimised nutrition. Similar changes have transformed the way we produce beef. Animals that were left on pasture would commonly take 4 or 5 years to reach their final weight. Now they're put onto pasture for 6 to 10 months and then moved to feedlots where they're fed optimised grain-based feed. After 5 months they should hit their market weight, roughly 50 weeks rather than 145. The growth in meat consumption led to the general improvements in the health of the population, supported the growing life expectancy that's become normal until the most recent couple of years. Meat, as you probably know, contains high quality protein, which means that it provides more of the different essential amino acids and it's more easily digestible. In a study of meat eating in Guangzhou in China that involved 20,000 men and women aged 50 years and above, daily meat eating was found to be positively associated with mental recall. Another study in Nepal showed similarly beneficial effects on growth and cognitive functions in children. According to the Food and Agriculture Association, a woman weighing 50 kilograms will need around 52 grams of protein a day, a 75 kilogram man around 62 grams a day. At the start of the century, average daily protein supply was over 100 grams per capita in the US, 90 grams in Japan, as well as in China. Meat supplied a third of all protein in the US as well as Brazil, more than a quarter in France and a fifth in China. Europe's the only continent where consumption of meat protein has stabilised at around 25 grams per day. Others have seen increases to above that, with Australia at 40 grams and the Americas at 30 grams. Of course, we know full well that there's been plenty of evidence of the negative health impacts of meat consumption as well. Studies that looked at red and processed meat consumption have long identified a link with, for instance, coronary heart disease. That said, such studies have been criticised for being poorly designed, since it's extremely hard to actually control for meat consumption removed from other lifestyle factors in modern societies. Plus, they often calculate the degree of risk by contrasting the highest and lowest quintiles of meat intake, which excludes most of the people in the middle who consume moderate amounts. But the controversy rages on, with many on the side of those arguing that in spite of such objections, the evidence is clear. And none of those objections really argue that there's strong evidence that means too much meat isn't bad for you. It mostly throws doubt on our ability to really quantify those effects in a meaningful way, and therefore to come up with accurate advice for the confused and anxious. Nevertheless, what we've seen in the last century has been an astonishing transformation, a massive spurt in the production of meat to a scale completely unlike anything the planet had seen before. In 1900, there were roughly 450 million heads of cattle, 195 million pigs and 600 million sheep. A century later, the cattle count was around 1.65 billion, 905 million pigs and 1 billion sheep. Domesticated animals overall made for 25 times more than the estimated biomass of all wild land mammals. Roughly a quarter of ice-free surfaces are used for livestock grazing. A third of all arable land is used to grow crops for animal feed. It has been a breathtaking transformation. And by the 1980s, the scale of that had started to make patently clear some unintended consequences, not least in terms of impact on the environment. Large-scale meat production impacts the land, water and the atmosphere, specifically deforestation, to convert land from forests and grasslands to grow feed crops such as soy or pasture land for cattle. Most tropical deforestation is done in order to provide grazing and feed for animals. Intensive meat production also sees the degradation of land through overgrazing and rising levels of water pollution, specifically runoff from the land of artificial nitrogen fertilizers which are used for feed crops. Although higher animal densities have reduced the cost of meat, which has had beneficial effects in nourishing people at lower income levels, it's also significantly increased the potential for the spread of infectious diseases, particularly where large numbers of animals are kept in close confinement, which has led to the overuse of antibiotics, which threatens impacts going right back up the food chain to ourselves, with bugs that are resistant to the use of antibiotics becoming more and more evident. The separation of animals from mixed farming has meant that manure, which was immensely beneficial in the previous context, can be produced in such quantities that it becomes a hard-to-handle waste with negative impacts of its own. And of course, as the human population has now, partly as a result of the immense prosperity the meat revolution originally gifted to us, continue to increase in size, people have drawn attention to the inefficiency of generating calories via meat rather than plants. Because although there are those people out there who like to argue that because our productivity and the use of resources massively increased in the past, proving wrong the Malthusians and others who predicted we would run out of those resources and starve, that therefore such productivity will continue to increase indefinitely. But of course, one constraint on all of that is that we only have a fixed amount of land. Maybe that constraint will be lifted if we get industrial scale lab-grown meat production. We watch that with interest, but for now that's some way off. Meat is superior in terms of its nutritional profile, but animals are relatively inefficient processors of calories, from plant calories to meat calories. So it raises the question about how should land most effectively be used. Ruminants such as cows and sheep are particularly inefficient converters of feed to meat. However, they do have the advantage that they mostly eat things that human beings can't. So we're not so much in competition when it comes to land use. They can forage on non-arable land and on residues from food crops that are not digestible by humans. Obviously, the more the process produces grain-based feed for them, the more that competition for land becomes an issue. Pigs are the most efficient producers of meat when it comes to mammals. They need 40% less fuel energy than you would otherwise expect for their body mass. At the fastest point of their growth, they convert nearly 2/3 of all of their metabolized energy into new body mass, which is higher even than chickens, which manage between 50 to 60%. There's also the question of competition for water, although the story on water isn't as clear as people sometimes make out. You quite often get very large figures quoted for the amount of water that went into producing something like a beef burger or a steak. But generally very little of that water really counts if you're talking about what gets removed from the environment, consumed. The majority of water goes into growing animal feedstuffs, and that draws on what's called green water, water supplied by rain, which evapotranspires back into the environment in the course of natural processes. It's been estimated that around 87% of all the water needed for livestock production is green water. In environments where such water is provided by abundant rain, it's just not an issue. More of a problem is countries where water is provided significantly by what's described as blue water, water drawn from deep and often declining aquifers. So the issue of water in meat production is, like many of these things, highly context specific, something that the generalised statistics used by campaign groups often ignores. The other issue with livestock, and one of those that's had the highest profile recently, is the contribution of enteric fermentation to greenhouse gas emissions. Large ruminants convert around 5 to 6% of their feed energy to methane. However, there are lots of variables with this figure. It comes down to feed quantity and quality and the feed digestibility. The annual emissions per head of dairy and beef cattle can vary wildly between, for instance, cows in North America and cows in India. Likewise, it gives scope for work that's now ongoing for devising optimised feeding practices for reducing enteric fermentation. Methane doesn't just come from burping cows, of course. It also comes from manure stored in slurry pits. Nice. The methane emissions from which can likewise vary enormously depending on the temperatures. Methane overall from meat production has a plus or minus 30 to 50% uncertainty rate, which can give you huge errors once you're talking about large numbers of animals. When it comes to CO2 emissions, these mainly come from tropical deforestation. This means that again, you can't generalise about the contribution of different types of meat. CO2 emissions in Europe and North America are significantly lower than those in South America. In addition to all of those aspects, of course, you also have to add the fact that a lot of current meat production methods include a wholly unacceptable amount of cruelty and suffering to animals. Now, that's a solvable problem. In itself, cruelty in meat production isn't a good argument against eating meat per se, because there's no reason those practices have to be used. Some relatively inexpensive changes to production processes could eliminate cruelty to animals at a stroke, and would probably include other beneficial side effects, such as reducing the need to use antibiotics as standard. So there's all of the context you can squeeze into a reasonable YouTube video. And it brings us back to the central question. Should we as a society eat meat? So let's recap. We respect the superior nutrition it represents and how it helped our species get here in the first place. We understand the history of its evolution that led to human societies coming out of poverty to deeply value it as highly desirable. And we understand how powerfully those attitudes persist in modern societies, long after we've forgotten where those attitudes came from. We appreciate the miracle of optimizing production that made our modern societies possible. But we also view with clear sight the huge environmental impacts of mass production and the potential negative health impacts of overconsumption. So where does that leave us? Right now, it's worth noting that worldwide, the trend remains for growing levels of meat eating. We've seen a declining trend in Europe. France, for instance, has seen the fastest decline in meat eating. Average consumption of all meat fell from 153 grams per day in 2017 to 135 grams in 2016, a 12% decline in 10 years. The growth in meat demand slows considerably once the average annual per capita income goes over $7,000, and it basically levels off after $10,000. That's an interesting fact, but of course an awful lot of the world's developing countries are well below that level, so there won't be an overall reduction in global meat demand anytime soon, even if it's reduced in high-income countries. But then the idea that the most efficient approach to worldwide food production would have no meat really doesn't make any sense. As I mentioned before, both grasslands and croplands produce material indigestible to humans that would otherwise be wasted. And large-scale human crops produce byproduct that makes perfect animal feeds. Now, you might need some changes to make use of that. For instance, reverse the European Union ban on using pig swill for feeding, which leads to an economic loss of about 15 billion euros per year and increases CO2 emissions because it has to be replaced by feed. Vaclav Smil estimated that the world could produce a reduced quantity of meat, around 200 metric tons per year. That would be possible without any further conversion of natural ecosystems to grazing land, so no more deforestation, and without direct feeding of grains or vegetables to animals, so no competition with human food grown on arable land. That's about 63% of the actual meat total grown in 2013 of 320 metric tons. And that would be a reduction in pasture-based meat production in low-income countries where grasslands have already been significantly degraded by overgrazing. Very much a vision of a final destination, the role that meat would play in a fully resource-optimised world. In the short term, of course, production of meat will continue and overall quantities will continue to rise as developing countries continue their journey. I get that there are some people who think that we should be able to move much faster than this and who take a simplistic meat equals bad approach, often quoting meat's contribution to greenhouse gases without going into the large number of things that can be done to reduce that impact. Food preferences are historically not easy to change. And for all the profile there's been on the subject in recent years, the numbers of actual vegetarians in most societies remains relatively minuscule, 2 to 4%. So my take on the logic of all of this is that we should be happy to embrace our tradition of meat eating as a human society. But for practicality's sake, we should be aiming to reduce meat consumption to a low level, not the tiny level put forward by the Eat Lancet report that made headlines a while ago, but by about a third. At the same time, we need to seriously tackle some of the downsides of the current system with its environmental impacts and the totally unacceptable cruelty of some of the current practices as well. If we value the meat, then that's the price we need to pay, solving those problems, because we can't have nice things if in the process we destroy all the other nice things. If we want to be successful in this, I would argue we need to change the parameters slightly within which people make free choices to eat what they like to eat, to influence the outcome while still keeping people happy. The alternative approach, wagging fingers and telling people what they are and are not allowed to eat, has been spectacularly unsuccessful to date and will probably continue to be so.